On Tuesday, I received these graphics cards, shiny new NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1660s, and although they're launched today, Thursday was somewhat expected since the 1660 Ti already debuted last month. Starting price of $220 for entry-level add-in board versions of the 1660 should make it very appealing to a lot of gamers out there. It still has 6 gigs of VRAM, although it is slower GDDR5, and it will only be available in third-party add-in board variants like these, the GTX 1660 Gaming X from MSI, the GTX 1660 XC from EVGA, and the GTX 1660 WindForce OC from Gigabyte.
Excellent!
The Corsair One is a gaming PC for people who want maximum performance with a minimal footprint. Don't let the size fool you though, there's a Core i9-9900K CPU and an RTX 2080 Ti in the Corsair One i160, kept chilly with convection-assisted cooling and separate closed loops for the CPU and GPU. There's also a Corsair One i140 with an i7-9700K and an RTX 2080, so click the sponsor link in the video description to learn more. So what's the difference between a GTX 1660 and a GTX 1660 Ti? They are both based on the 12nm Turing TU116 GPU, which does not include RTX capabilities, so no RT cores, no hardware support for ray tracing or DLSS like you get with RTX cards, which honestly isn't a huge loss in my opinion. So the main difference is fewer streaming multiprocessor units and CUDA cores. 22 SMs on the 1660 versus 24 on the Ti, 1408 CUDA cores down from 1536 on the Ti, and then you have slower 8,000 MHz effective GDDR5 VRAM on the 1660 versus faster 12,000 MHz effective GDDR6 on the Ti. In either case, the GPU has 6 32-bit memory controllers for a 192-bit bus, and the default base and boost clock are also a bit faster on the 1660 at 1530 and 1785 MHz respectively, as compared to the Ti, which starts at a base clock of 1500 and a boost of 1770. So all of these cards I have here are manufacturer overclocked versions with boost clocks bumped up to 1830. Supplemental board power is provided by an 8-pin PCI Express graphics power connector, and my Gigabyte and MSI cards have 3 DisplayPort 1.4 outs and 1 HDMI 2.0B, and then the EVGA goes with NVIDIA's reference specs for video outs, which is 1 HDMI, 1 DisplayPort, and 1 DVI. These cards do not have USB Type-C for virtual link support, but board partners do have the option to add that if they want. So speaking of these 3 cards, they all have their unique qualities, starting with the EVGA 1660 XC, which is actually a 3-slot card. This allows it to stay pretty short, only about 7.5 inches long, but there is a big fat fin stack underneath that cooler thanks to the 3rd slot. We also have a single cooling fan and unfortunately no backplate. So I think this card would be great for some mini ITX builds where card length can be an issue, but definitely not actually for some mini ITX builds where the 3rd slot might conflict with the power supply, which is the case in a lot of smaller cases out there. So just bear in mind when you're picking your case, if you go with this card, that it is a slightly different form factor, although I applaud EVGA for going for something that's a little bit more different and unique. This one's going to go for $230, which is $10 more than the base price for the 1660, but EVGA said there will also be a $10 mail-in rebate available at launch. The MSI Ventus XS is next, and this will also be a $230 GTX 1660. MSI has gone with a 2-slot design for this one, and they have also added a backplate, which is plastic, but I actually think it looks quite nice. Not bad, at least, for a plastic backplate. It's got sort of a faux brushed metal finish, and it kind of wraps around to meet up with the shroud that is on the heatsink, which also sports a single copper heat pipe and a 2-fan cooler. This card measures at 8 inches long, so still pretty short and pretty compact, and again, just an 8-pin PCI Express power connector. Finally, we have the Gigabyte GTX 1660 WindForce OC, and this one will sell for the MSRP of $220, and it's a 2-slot design, much like the MSI. It does come in a bit longer at about 8 7/8 inches long, but that's still about an inch shorter than the width of most standard ATX motherboards, so I think in most systems that length isn't going to be a conflict issue. It does also have a wraparound backplate on the back with a Gigabyte logo and a bit of 3D texture that also kind of matches up with the shroud on the front, so I thought that was a pretty nice design. And again, we have an aluminum fin stack with a single copper heat pipe providing some extra heat dissipation from the GPU. Now lastly, I wanted to point out card height, or the amount of height that's above the PCI Express bracket, and for that one, the EVGA actually comes in as the shortest The Gigabyte would be a bit in the middle. It is a bit taller than the bracket, but then the MSI one is definitely the tallest of the three. So my first order of business for testing is to see which of these three cards I like the best to do further testing to compare against the other benchmarks that I have. To do this, I set up two tests: the 3D Mark Time Spy burn-in test that loops for about 20 minutes to get a measure of temperature as well as clock speeds, and then the Firestrike Ultra run so I can get some scores that I can compare against each other. These are all using the same GPU, so the differentiating factors should be those operating temperatures and sustained clock speeds. Also bear in mind, when it comes to base and boost clock speeds, all three of these, at least according to GPU-Z, were running at the same frequency: 1530 base clock, 1830 boost clock. The EVGA GTX 1660 XC hit an average temperature of 70 degrees Celsius, a max temperature of 74 degrees Celsius, average clock speed of about 1854, and a max clock speed of 1965. System power draw during the Time Spy burning test was 184 watts on average, and then when I ran 3D Mark Firestrike Ultra, the graphics score was 2742. MSI GTX 1660 Ventus XS had an average temperature of 70 and a max temp of 74, pretty much the same temps as the EVGA card. Average clock speed was 1858, just a few ticks faster, and the max clock speed was 1965, exactly the same. System power draw was actually a little bit less at 178 watts, and the 3D Mark Firestrike Ultra graphics score was 2741. Finally, the Gigabyte GTX 1660 WindForce OC had an average temperature of 68 degrees, which was the coolest of the three, max temp of 74, which was identical to the other two, average clock speed of 1856, which was right in between, max clock speed of 1995, which gives it the win for max clock speed, system power draw of 181 watts, and then the 3D Mark Firestrike Ultra graphics score of 2763. All of these are within a margin of error of each other, and I'm not going to say that one of these cards is necessarily better than the others because the scores